Much, all of you panelists. That was really terrific. I'm going to be the transition person for the next panel. This has been just a terrific morning of real interesting cases and nuts and bolts and important questions answered. So I just appreciate all of what's come before, and now excited about the next panel. And very happy to introduce John Shapiro, who is the moderator. John is a full-time professor in the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment at Pratt Institute after having served as its chair for many years. He also has 25 years or more experience as a planning consultant and is a beloved faculty member at Pratt. So John, I will turn the mic over to you to launch the last panel of the morning.
Thank you. So we're going to do something different. We've been talking about the present. We're going to be switching to the immediate, office conversions, intermediate, new energy laws, and long-term futures, sea rise and increased flooding, facing the adaptive reuse and redevelopment of historic structures. So Robert Fuller is a principal of the national powerhouse design firm of Gensler. He'll be talking about the office to housing conversion question, which is on everyone's mind given the implosion of the office market due to COVID and remote work. Robert's already worked on these projects, and he participated in a international study in Canada and New York, Canada and the United States, of 400 office buildings and whether they lend themselves to conversion. What industrial loft buildings were to adaptive reuse, and then starting in the 1970s, offices will be starting now. Office buildings will be starting now. And we're all making lots of prognostications and laying out opinions and creating incentives. And I think Robert's in the best position to say, what should we really expect? P.S. Robert, I didn't know this when we invited him, but Robert is an alum of Pratt Institute's architecture program. So Mark Ginsberg of Curtis Ginsberg Architects will be discussing the complexity of energy efficiency for historic buildings and the new expectations embodied in the New York City laws that will be ramping up between 2024 and 2030. So it's not first and foremost in everyone's mind, but it's coming very fast. Mark is the ultimate expert on New York City zoning, building codes, housing design. He can take credit for about 20,000 housing units in New York City alone. He's also a thought and civic leader as the president of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, former president of the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And congratulations to Mark, who now is joining the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. So when it comes to the interplay of market codes, design, preservation, and the whole variety of housing typologies in New York City, there's no one better to unpack the questions of what energy compliance and expectations will mean for preservation and adaptive reuse. And then finally, Gita co-founded the Thread Collective Design Studio, which is an up-and-coming, small, hands-on design firm, which works at the nexus of design, ecology, and place. That's what Gita teaches at Pratt Institute, including our resiliency studio for communities and lead for existing buildings. LEED being the national standard for how to bring a building up to resiliency and sustainability, greater achievement of those goals. So higher tides and deeper floodplains are inevitable. The question is how fast and how deep it will go into New York City and other cities, not whether it will happen. And thanks to her training, her teaching, her practice, and activism, Gita, no one understands this better than the interplay of flooding. I want to add, Gita isn't, like a lot of you in the audience, Gita is an activist. She's leading a community group in Red Hook, and she's super active in another community group in her second city of Newburgh. So she brings to bear that very local perspective as well that a lot of you will care about. So we're going to start with Robert and the immediate future, then go to Mark, the intermediate, and Gita for not so long in the future. Robert.
Great. All right, thank you, Mark. Let me share my screen here, and I'll get started. Hopefully, you guys can see this. So, as Mark said, we've been involved. I want to go a little bit of a history lesson of how we really got involved in this intimately. This idea of office to residential conversions. We've all been hearing a ton about. Everyone's talking about it as that we're going to see this wave of conversions. We've been helping many of our both public and private sector clients, really kind of assess, what buildings really make sense for this and which don't. We've heard varying estimates of how many potential units this might unlock in various cities. And it's, not every building is obviously makes sense, but this is such a hot topic for most of our developer clients, and again, and for municipalities, particularly those clients that own, class B and C office stock, which are even more challenged now. So I'm gonna give a little bit of history lesson for us. This started, John mentioned this. This started for us in Calgary. Calgary in late 2019-18 formed their Economic Development Corporation, kind of formed a group together. They asked us to be a part of to kind of help them assess their huge vacancy rates that they were having in their downtown. Calgary started having vacancy issues, as far as back as a decade ago, as energy sector and other folks were moving out. And so the problem they were having is what the same problem that a lot of other cities are having now, which is not just vacant office space, but it was hurting their downtown, right? Restaurants were closing, shops were closing. It just was, the life of downtown was suffering. So the problem that they had was they had dozens of buildings they needed to analyze. They really wanted to identify if this conversion idea really made sense and how many buildings really were were suitable candidates. They didn't necessarily have the time or the money to hire us or any other architecture firm to kind of do a really detailed, in-depth analysis. So we really kind of struggled at that time, say, okay, what's a way that we can kind of quickly assess the basic bones and infrastructure of these buildings to see if they really made sense for conversions. So we didn't do this alone. There was developers sitting at the table, there was contractors, there were city officials, but we started to say, we kind of created what, this scoring index, this around these 5 kind of major criteria, right? Context, building form, floor plate, envelope, and servicing. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail. And we weighted them, right? The idea here was to kind of create a kind of compatibility score that we call it, by making this high level assessment. Obviously building form and floor plate are probably the 2 most important factors. And that's why they were weighted heavier than some of the others. If you kind of just think about what would be the hardest thing to change on some of these buildings, for obvious reasons, those sort of carried the most weight. So just going through it, right? This we kind of first pass, we're looking at the building site context and positioning. Is it in a good walkable neighborhood? Is it near transit? Does it have good natural light and views? And we're kind of trying to assess, and we're just answering a series of questions that kind of help. They're kind of data points that we put in that help us sort of create this score. The building form is, pretty intuitive, pretty straightforward, right? You try to kind of imagine without actually getting in there and laying out units, would the building form, kind of give good livable units? How easy is it going to plan? Is it an odd shape? Does it have odd ins and outs? The all important core to window depth. Lindsay hit on this in the previous panel. She talked about the article recently about 180 water. We're working on 160 water directly next door to it. Currently it's under construction and definitely had some challenges of a 1960s, 70s office building with a deep floor plate. And how do you make that, into viable units? So we're looking at the floor plate size, the floor to floor heights, number of elevators. In most cases, the office buildings are over elevated as it relates to residential. Typically you need fewer of that, but I'd say that core to window depth is probably one of the single biggest factors. Of course, then we're looking at the envelope. Does it have punched windows? Does it have operable windows? Is it, we're seeing more and more of these 60s, 70s, 80s commercial office buildings that have old curtain walls that really perform poorly. They're not so easy to retrofit into operable windows. So what is that ease of replacement or retrofit? And then we have kind of a servicing bucket, which sort of, we kind of quickly highlight the structural system, whether or not it has parking. Again, this is a tool we're using across North America, so that parking question is much more important in some other cities than it is necessarily here in New York. And then we give a, without getting into any detailed due diligence, we take a quick look at the MEP system. Although we're finding is that more often than not, we're replacing the MEP system in total when we're converting to residential. A lot of times these centralized forced air systems that you see in commercial office buildings just aren't suitable if you're converting to residential. That as a lot of these panels have been talking about the financing and feasibility of these projects, that's actually one argument that often works in favor of conversion, ironically, because some of these buildings, the MEP systems are at the end of their useful life. And even to kind of maintain current energy standards, and even if you were to maintain it in its current use, there's quite a significant amount of capital investment required. So that often, the full replacement is often not such a big deal. And then what we do is we have about 25 or 30 data inputs. Again, this is about a quick high level assessment, right? Nothing really replaces sort of rolling up your sleeves and kind of digging into it. As we've been doing this for different municipalities and different private developers around the country, we've now got about 700 buildings, John, in our database. I think we studied about 130 in New York City, and that's rapidly growing. And what we try to, again, what the goal of this is to create what we call a compatibility score. This is a dashboard of the Calgary study when it was in process. At this point, we had 25 buildings from Calgary in the study. I think we ended up studying over 50 for them. It's an interactive dashboard where we can kind of click on a specific property and go to its scorecard. And you can kind of see how it's scored in each of those 5 categories. As a very general rule, as we've been doing this more and more, we kind of say if a building scores at 80% or higher, it's probably a pretty good candidate. It's checking a lot of the boxes in terms of how it will physically lay out as a residential building. Between 70 and 80, it's maybe there's some compromises, maybe there's some challenges, but it's worth looking into more. Buildings that are in the 60s or below, I don't want to say it can't be done, because anything can be done with time and creativity and money, but those might not be the ones you want to spend your time focus on. And that was exactly the goal of this for Calgary, was they wanted to identify their 10 or 15 best candidates and really dial in on them. And ultimately what they wanted to get out of this was to develop what they were trying to figure out what their incentive program was going to be. What were they going to provide to developers? Now, their incentive program ended up being pretty straightforward. You can see here they were offering in their phase 1 priority area, which they highlighted, several building owners applied. I think they have 6 projects that were identified that are moving forward now. It is worth noting they did not have an affordability requirement on this, which is another layer to this whole thing. But it was a very straightforward, streamlined approach. We've since worked with several other cities. Chicago just released their incentive program for the LaSalle Street corridor. I think there's about 5 projects that have applied and been accepted to that incentive program as well. We recently were, spoke in front of the last city council meeting to talk about this study and what we're doing with some other cities now. But we're also doing this for a lot of our private clients who are saying, look, here's my portfolio of underperforming buildings. I'm either interested in maybe offloading some of these assets, or maybe maybe the opposite is true. We're in acquisition mode and we need some quick feedback on whether these would be feasible. So the creation of this tool, it was done specifically for this Calgary study, has actually gotten a lot of legs, and it's been quite useful. Obviously with COVID and all the challenges that many of our cities are having. So, this has been, as I said at the beginning, the topic for everyone. It'll be interesting to see if this does result in kind of the wave of actual conversions, because as many buildings as we're studying, there's actually not that many happening right now. And I think that's just because financially it's tough to make pencil out. The basis cost that you're starting here in New York is tough, right? The building acquisition cost is makes it a tough starting point to make these things happen. And then, of course, we've all been seeing, the mayor actually, gave his press conference at 160 last week, his latest kind of salvo to the state. We're going to have to see close coordination between, the multiple dwelling law, current zoning, kind of a thoughtful mix of incentives, regulatory changes, and affordability requirements to see if this really takes off. So we've been kind of going about this phased approach. The project scorecard is really the first step. Here's an example of a New York City building that we actually had to kind of score kind of the low, mid, and high rise levels separately because they score quite a bit differently, right? And then kind of give an aggregate score on what we thought the compatibility is. If a building scores favorably, we'll also go to the next step where we actually start kind of doing very basic demising and test fits to kind of get that net to gross ratio. Oftentimes client has no idea what the unit mix might be. It is interesting. We're really sensitive, as architects, we want to do good quality livable units. There is sort of there's a qualitative aspect to this that we do see a lot of people just trying to shoehorn units in, right? So they become these long, deep units. Are they really the most livable? So that's always a balance as we go back and forth. So we would love to see, kind of incentive programs that make sense, that don't feel like, people use the term giveaway programs, that work with the development community on common sense incentive programs that kind of can help move this forward. So quick takeaways, under the right circumstances, these are feasible if the building kind of makes sense. We think this is one important step to addressing the housing shortages that we all have talked about. But like I said a minute ago, the success of this will ultimately come down to the devil will be in the details, right? On the whatever zoning amendments, incentives, and affordability requirements get layered into this discussion. Close coordination between the state and the city is important. Also, I know this is Gita's territory. We'll talk about sustainability and resiliency, but we think that's a huge thing here, right? We're actually building into the tool an estimated embodied carbon savings by adaptively reusing these structures, which we think is a great story, especially as more and more lenders have their own ESG commitments and goals. And we think this could have a good, not only impact at the building level, but at a neighborhood and citywide level. As we talk about taking some districts that were purely commercial and making them a little bit more mixed use in nature. So I'll end there, try to keep us on schedule, and jump to the next one.
Excellent. Mark.
Okay, okay, 1 second, let me share here. Can everyone see the screen? And let me get rid of these. Okay, thank you. So I think a lot of this discussion, why is it? Is everyone seeing that, like, everything I say is coming up on the screen? Anyway, a lot of this discussion is how we balance competing goods. So preservation is a good, housing production is critical. The mayor and governor have ambitious plans that I'm not sure are ambitious enough, but they're not necessarily getting support. And sustainability in our low carbon future. So first, I want to be clear, I'm speaking as an individual and in no way the Landmarks Commission. So I think climate change is the existential issue. New York City and state, as I'll show a bit more, are leaders on this. In New York City, 70% of the carbon footprint is from buildings because of our density, while nationally it's 35 to 40%. And so getting into carbon footprint, this is just to point out that I'm going to talk about density, but the other major factor in carbon footprint per capita is wealth. And so New York State has the lowest per capita carbon footprint in the country, except for Washington, D.C., and that's because Washington, D.C. is all a city. And if we had New York City, my guess is it would be significantly lower than Washington. And then it's hard to get data correcting for wealth and looking at carbon footprint. But what I did here is compared Scarsdale, which as it happens is where John grew up, to Tribeca, which are both very wealthy neighborhoods. One in the city, the other not. And Tribeca's carbon footprint per capita is less than half of Scarsdale's. So I think there is a clear message here. We need to densify. But in addition, we're going to talk about things like sea level rise. But the way we minimize that, and the city and state have local law 97, and the state has the has a similar act. The city has banned gas in new construction between 2025 and 2027. The state has proposed that, and also proposed that any fossil fuel appliances, stoves, boilers, etc., will be banned from sale in 2035. So the writing is on the wall, but that we're going to need to electrify. But we need to improve the envelope. First, this is a presentation, a slide on passive house principles, and we've done 7 passive house buildings which meet the 2050 requirements today. And the first thing you do is have a really well insulated envelope, control solar gain, and deal with thermal bridging. And the other thing, as importantly on the envelope, is you create it very tight. So there's very little air coming in. So then you have to provide fresh air, and the exhaust air, you want to recover the heat. And then you minimize mechanical. So this is Baychester Murphy, one of the houses in Baychester, where we overclad with EFIS continuous insulation. This along with new windows and roof insulation cut the energy consumption by about 20% without doing anything else. It also put the existing deteriorated brick facade within a envelope, so it never went through a freeze thaw cycle. And also, and I know it's subjective, a lot of the public housing is relatively banal, and we were able to re-image it so it didn't look like the projects. I realize for important historic buildings, this would be a no-no. This is PS 90 that we converted. It had been abandoned for 40 years, and we converted it into 75 units of housing, of which 20 were affordable, and the home for the National Dance Institute. And on the left, you can see the before and the after. We didn't get tax credits because basically the inside was gutted. Most of the slabs had to be replaced, but it preserved. Also, we had to go to the BSA for permission to convert it because it was over FAR. But this is an important point with historic buildings. Not only can you save the embodied carbon, but in significant number of cases, you can save a building bigger than what you'd be allowed to replace it. Our client said it ended up being more costly than building a new building, though, so it's not a simple answer. We may also want to look at, with landmark buildings and historic buildings, an ability to transfer air rights over a larger area, because often they're landlocked and can't transfer them. But the other thing we have to understand is that would need to be coupled with a loosening of the zoning envelope at the receiving site to make it possible to transfer a significant amount of air rights. And finally, following up with what Bob said, we need the money. This isn't cheap. And so we've talked about historic building tax credits, which don't always work, but where they work can be great. But right now, there are proposals for a 421A like program. There's also the there are a number of programs, but our basic problem is our property taxes are extremely heavy for residential rental buildings. And if you don't have some sort of incentive, it doesn't pencil out. And in addition, as we electrify, which is significant cost, we're going to have to figure out how to help the owners be able to pay for it. And with that, thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. And Gita.
I am going to share my screen. So, one second. Okay, so what does the future look like? Hopefully, if we decarbonize, we take some of our office buildings, we turn them to residential, we'll be in good shape. But at the same time, we are looking at a very serious issue with sea level rise. We are a coastal community, 520 miles of coastline edge our 5 boroughs. And so this is a very, very real future for us. And we have to really consider today how we're gonna address our cities for 2100. And I consider myself a little bit of a futurist, always thinking about what we're doing now and how that impacts both humans and our occupants and our world, and what that will do for us in the next 100 years. So, existing structures, that's what we're talking about today. Adaptive reuse. 85% of the buildings that exist in 2030 already exist today. So it is literally like the fabric of our city is what we have to address in order to create, a world that is going to be resilient and adaptable. And I guess one of the questions, sort of I want to address also is just like, what does it mean to be resilient? Often it means bouncing back in the light of, a serious event. How do we future-proof our buildings in preparation for serious events? And, that happens on an interim basis. So, but in the reality, we live day to day, and we really want to think about like, how do we create buildings and our cityscape so that way it's a better place just to live, right? So, the amount of structures in our floodplains is drastic. We have 71,000 buildings in the floodplain in 2013, but with the changing of the maps and with increasing sea level rise, we're looking at over 100,000 buildings, and realistically close to 14% of our population. And, a majority of those are folks living in NYCHA housing and in low-income properties, just because that's the nature of what was developed last. And so it's a very serious consideration of how we're building in the floodplain. When we think about sea level rise, we're looking at minimum, 12 inches a foot by 2050, and realistically 2 to 3 feet by 2100. And so when we think about historic buildings in our historic districts, they literally are squarely within that floodplain. The sort of where we are here today, energy resilience, what Mark just talked about, looking at water and how water and stormwater management with existing structures and landscapes, that is like literally the trifecta. And if we can consider those issues, that's the trifecta of sort of creating a better future. So historic buildings historically have been literally built to exist without, lots of energy. And so they are a really great sort of just building stock to be working with. This is an example of Dia Beacon, natural daylight tends to flood these very old buildings. Robert just talked about how our sort of mid-century buildings maybe do not, these office buildings, right? But we have to think about what is the existing fabric that we have and what are the attributes and how can we take advantage of those elements to create sort of just future proofing of the city. In our office right now, we work on a whole number of different scales, from warehouses and manufacturing spaces to residential. We happen to be working on a lot of historic buildings right now that are this sort of mid-range townhouse, not affordable housing necessarily, but these historic structures are sort of coming up right now, I feel like, and they are originally built in the 1800s. They need literally gut renovations in order to be able to make it through the energy code and to meet issues of resilience. And so when you're looking at these structures, we're very often not doing a little piece by piece renovation, but it is a complete sort of reworking of the structure and taking it back down to its skin and bones in order to make these viable for the future. Insulation, new windows, and what happens to end up being a really critical aspect is the electrification, right? All of these projects are now going to be 100% electric, dealing with the HVAC systems and split units and being the most energy efficient possible. Like in terms of resilience, a lot of these mechanics have to go on the roof. And so when we start thinking about the roof, local law 92 kicks in, your roofscape ends up being one of your most critical areas of a renovation. And so local law 92 in a way is beneficial in that it's really pushing New York City and renovations to address sort of a sustainable roofscape with green and solar roof requirements. And on larger buildings, we're able to achieve maybe resilient power hubs or community solar arrays. And on smaller systems, we're able to really just think about like, how do we create a net zero type of building? And the roofscape is just an asset, but realistically, it ends up being almost like one of the most critical parts of the renovation. And so restructuring, dealing with the types of new membranes, and then also making it a very beautiful habitable space goes hand in hand with just sort of the approach of being able to use that as another asset to a building. But thinking about the roofscape not only is for energy production, but also stormwater management, green roofs are a critical asset to that. For most existing structures at sort of this mid-level scale, you don't have a lot of lot area. And so, the area that you're going to rely on is really the roofscape in order to meet sort of stormwater management. And then, integrating both solar and green roofs together. That's, an approach of ours that feels a very efficient way if we're sort of looking at density, but being able to marry those two together is just an approach that sort of makes sense. And you're able, if you create these solar roof canopies that fly above the roof line, you're able to embed a green roof below, and you can actually have the two of them work hand in hand together. And then if you are working sort of on a larger scale and more commercial based retrofits, we have been doing power hubs in which you're creating a building microgrid system. So you're taking that building almost offline and you're able to create solar arrays and green roof systems that then marry with battery backup systems. So that way they can be off grid and offline in the event of emergencies. And you can sort of start to create that also and connect that into a community power hub system as well. This is just a little bit of a vision. Maybe what our historic districts could look like. This is actually Newburgh, which has one of the largest downtown historic districts in the state. And this is where we just sort of envisioned what happens if you did sort of take over parking lots and green roofs. And the city of Newburgh is also under a consent decree order in terms of stormwater management and the Clean Water Act. And being able to capture close to 1 billion gallons of water will necessitate that its downtown get pretty radically reconfigured. And so really thinking about how landscape can be a pretty key aspect to being solutions for a resilient future, it does necessitate thinking about what the change will be to our urban fabric. And so with that, there's lots to talk about, I'm sure, and answer questions.
Okay, thank you. All right, so one question that came in, Robert, can you give us a sense of proportion in any of these cities, Calgary in particular, how many housing units might be going forward in the immediate future that you project could be created in total? And maybe put that in perspective of the size of the city. You know, saying 5,000 units in New York versus 5,000 units in Calgary are two quite different things.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I answered in the chat, you know, one of the questions, you know, in phase one, 6 projects have been approved, and collectively it's not even 1,000 units, right? It's 700 and something units. So it's debatable whether that's really starting to move the needle. I think, you know, this first pass at it, they had a relatively small geographic area. But I think you need to start getting into, I think for Calgary, you know, they never really had a minimum threshold they were trying to hit. But I think they would probably have to start hitting, you know, 3,000-4,000 units before it really started to have the impact that I think they're hoping for. But obviously that's a much smaller city than New York. So I think for us, you know, 2,000-3,000 units is sort of a couple of large projects, right? You know, 160 Water, we're getting 600 units in that building alone versus the 700 building collectively across 5 or 6 projects in Calgary. So they're definitely operating at a different scale. They have a lot of smaller buildings, and it's just going to take more time and more projects to apply to it. So I think part of it too is like getting the message out and sort of almost getting more people in the know about, you know, the incentives that are available.
And Robert, another question from Francois Bullock is, okay, so we've got these modernist and postmodernist buildings with the curtain walls, and now you're saying they're going to be residential, presumably with windows that are operable. So what do you do to solve that problem?
It's a tough one, and I think it's going to be a building by building answer, John. I think we'll see. It's interesting. It was a commercial renovation, but we were involved in the renovation of the podium at Citicorp Tower, and all of a sudden there was a big rush. Maybe this should be landmarked. You know, right as our client was thinking about making a renovation. I think we might see more of that as more of these buildings might be earmarked for conversions. But it's a real challenge to do in a way that is still respectful to the existing building character. You know, I think, again, using 160 and 180 Water as an example, again, they're not designated or historic buildings per se, but we were able to kind of integrate an operable window into the curtain wall framing in a and I would argue a relatively minimal impact way that kind of kept the original look of the building. What was harder is we actually did add insulation on the outside, you know, to Mark's point, because we wanted to help the building perform better as well. And so we did actually build out the spandrels, and that arguably even more than the operable windows had a bigger impact. So I think the operable window and the energy upgrade question have to be looked at hand in hand in terms of how we approach it. But there's no blanket answer that I can give you, John, that would apply to every building.
So, Gita, so thinking about that Newberg illustration and Mark's comment about competing goods, competing public benefits. So on the one hand, that looked amazing, you know, just viscerally, I loved it. On the other hand, hey, that's an historic district. And, you know, think about our own Soho, where the Landmarks Preservation Commission said no trees, because that's not authentic to an industrial district been preserved. So where have you seen this conflict? How do you suggest that it be resolved? What process or criteria?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really, really difficult question. So, you know, and we're in the chat right now talking about what's visible from the street in historic districts, you know, and can solar canopies work? and you can do a lot of these rooftop, sort of recommendations to meet the green and solar codes by, having them be set back, so that way they are out of visible sight lines. The treescape is a bigger question. We need more trees. Like, there's just no way around it. Like, trees are the incredible multiple benefits that exist between, planting a tree and what will happen in 100 years it's incredibly important. And we literally cannot plant enough trees probably at the moment, let alone maintain them. So the question is, how do we think about these landscapes, not just what they used to be, but what they are going to be in the future, and what compatibility we're looking for in terms of the world that we live in. So I think that the structure, the question is, like, would they have planted trees 100 years ago? Probably, because that was literally a way that they created shade without a mechanical system. I mean, sometimes we want to actually rely on these natural conditions more than our mechanical conditions. And in the light of resilience, should an event happen, it could potentially still be around, whereas your mechanical systems may not if our electricity goes out. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is. There's a lot of preservation issues around these questions. I think we just also have to think about, like, what is this world going to look like in 100 years? With trees you planted today, it will still be functioning in 100 years, hopefully, if we maintain it and give it love.
So, Mark, I asked that question of Gita, her firm does landscape architecture as well, and she's an expert in green infrastructure, about the site. What are the friction points for buildings in terms of both the current new laws, which go into full effect in 2024 and 2030, and also the prospective law changes to zoning, such as that you can put solar canopy on 100% of a roof?
Well, let me start with a conundrum. And I'm going to be a bit of a Debbie Downer in terms of preservation. And then we got two other architecture firms, studied 15 buildings that we had put photovoltaic on. And with zoning limitations, fire department access, and the fact that there's mechanical equipment up there, we basically could cover a third of the roof. City planning has already, in the Gowanus rezoning, changed the zoning to allow a solar canopy over the entire roof, which will triple the amount of power generated. And so, but it's going to be visible. And often you need to put the structure on bearing walls that are at the facade, and it can be removable, but to generate the power we need, that's an issue. The other issue on the issue of roofs that Gita was talking about, creating recreational roofs on existing buildings is tricky for the following reasons. One is they're often not designed for the required structural load. And two, you need to create handicapped access, which typically requires extending the elevator up to the roof. You're going to want to enclose the elevator doors because they don't do well when they're totally exposed in a vestibule. And that gets very expensive. And so we've done it, and it can really be beautiful and wonderful for the residents, and create also, as you're increasing density by creating recreation space in the building, you're reducing the load on the local parks, etc. But it's complicated. So did I at least start to answer the questions you had, John?
Oh, absolutely. So I'll shift to a question as a closing question for all three of you. It's a complex question. We're talking often, when we talk about adaptive reuse, of isolated buildings. The one loft building in East Williamsburg, or the one office building, or several office buildings in West Midtown. And that's not the same thing as creating a neighborhood. I mean, downtown Brooklyn, for example, is largely a transient neighborhood because it lacks the schools, the parks, the street life associated with a residential neighborhood. So thinking on a broader scale, what can we do per building or not? You don't think it should be a burden of the building to help create the residential character as we convert buildings to housing?
Can
You know, an office building in an office district to housing, an industrial building in an industrial district to housing.
So let me start, John, with the 2 or 3 answers. First of all, my son lives in downtown Brooklyn. He doesn't have kids, so the schools aren't an issue, but he's happy as a clam. So, and he's been there now for 2 years. But our office is in Lower Manhattan. I was involved in the 1995 rezoning of Lower Manhattan to make it easier to convert buildings. And I think that's a model for Midtown. When I leave the office at 6, 7 at night, Wall Street, which is closed off for security reasons, is a dog run. And there recently was a Whole Foods that opened here. There, you know, as the buildings convert, things will change. I also, just as another example, live in Tribeca, which I have for 33 years. And when we moved in, there were very few services and we dealt with that. And over time, we now have really good services. So I think, maybe a stupid phrase, but if you build it, they will come. The services will come. The city will build schools. That many of the utilities like sewers and electricity are already there.
Gita, maybe you could look at the same question from a community perspective. An activist that after Robert goes, I'll give you a chance to think about that for a second. And Robert?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit to what Mark said. I mean, I think it's a good question, right? Especially we're looking at buildings that for most of the buildings we're looking at are in pretty heavily commercial districts, right? So they're not traditionally mixed use, and they don't have some of that neighborhood retails that you'd like to see in a residential community. So I think kind of rethinking and broadening that definition of active retail uses, I think could be beneficial. You know, I was just looking, you know, again, some of the Calgary examples, again, not to you know, beat that study to death, but you know, some of those projects are, you know, they're doing like co-working spaces for small businesses on the ground floor that help, you know, for entrepreneurs and to help incubate spaces. You know, there are some daycare facilities, things like that. Some community flex space, artist studios, all that stuff sounds great. It's not necessarily revenue generating for the building owner. It's tough to beat. So I don't know, maybe something could be included in the regulations, or there's could be some incentivization to include, you know, requirements for more institutional, you know, community-based uses. Could be an interesting discussion and see where that fits in. Because I think it's hard to sometimes get the traditional building owner developer to not think about traditional inline retail and the numbers those used to generate, but we know the challenges with that, right? We see too many boarded up storefronts as it is. So just some thoughts.
I mean, I think that one of the number one ways that mid to larger scale buildings can contribute to communities is by, and this is actually a way to deal with roofscapes, you know, that don't require, you know, sort of community uses, but allows for community solar programs to be put on them. And so that is a very large and growing program that allows for residents who don't have the ability to put solar on their roofs. And so a community solar program, you know, doesn't require public access. Often the, you know, building owner can actually benefit from it. There's an economic benefit, there's a long-term benefit. And so that is a way that it can, you know, a lot of these buildings can contribute both locally and just across the city. We're finding that it's gaining movement right now.
So here's my key takeaway from your answers. First, Mark, touche. As you know, I'm an office to housing curmudgeon. So So, points well taken, but more broadly, I think all of you and some of the earlier speakers too, you know, when you think about the future, we've actually going through some very drastic changes. You know, climate change will make COVID and the implosion of the office market look minor. And these are happening sooner than we think. Gita, my own research is that the inflection point's not 2100, it's 2080.
Or 2050.
Or 2050, that's right. So in the chat, among the panelists and in the questions and occasional remarks, what I heard is that there's a need to think about the future of preservation in light of these big changes, in addition to fighting the fights of the moment. And that requires a broad, interdisciplinary negotiation. You know, as Mark, you said it, different benefits and goods are weighed against each other. So that's my takeaway from you, from our panel mainly. Do any of you want to add a final takeaway, and then we'll close it out? Either Vicky or
oh, sorry.
Oh no, go.
I was just going to say that NYCHA is a fairly low density development. There was a really good show at the Skyscraper Museum on that a few years ago, and is both an opportunity, but is a controversial opportunity.
Opportunity in terms of new development and
Potentially, yeah.
As well as any historic character for the landscape or buildings. Okay. Robert or Gita, any closing thought?
I don't think so. I think you summed it up well, John. I think.
Yeah, spot on.
Vicky.
Well, I just ask Frampton to also open his mic and just thank you all so much. I don't know, Frampton, if you had some closing remarks you were planning to make. I found this conversation, as all of these, to be both inspiring, but really thought-provoking. And I think the work going forward with John's summation of the takeaway is how, what's the process by which we continue this conversation and think about the trade-offs, think about the way these interests align and we can be fellow travelers, but the way the interests may compete and how we're going to balance our thinking about preservation and resiliency and sustainability so that we can get the future that we seek, as Gita has talked about, what is the future we want to see. So I thought that was a really, really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate all of you.
Yes, I echo everything that Vicky said, and just look forward to continuing these conversations with the preservation community and being part of these solutions. So with that, I do also want to thank Vicky and our co-host, Pratt Institute's Historic Preservation Graduate Program. I want to thank our sponsors, AIA New York Historic Buildings Committee, AIA Brooklyn, Higgins, Quays, Barth and Partners, and HGC's board president, John Bacon. And I do hope we'll do more programs like this. So please get on HGC's mailing list and support our work to allow us to do this. And thank you again to all of our inspiring speakers today. We will be in touch with a follow-up to this program and hope to see you at an event soon.
And I just want to add a big thank you to Frampton and the HTC team who worked very, very hard to make this happen today. So we really appreciate you, HTC.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you soon.